Captain H.R. McMaster heard the shooting before he understood what it meant. Not the deep bark of a tank cannon. Something lighter and faster and coming from the wrong place. Machine guns. And underneath them, the heavy hammering of an anti-aircraft gun that somebody had lowered until it was pointing flat across the desert, straight at his scouts, from a cluster of buildings that was not on any map he had been given. He was 28 years old. He had 9 tanks. The sky was the colour of dirty brass. It was the middle of the afternoon and it looked like dusk. It had rained hard in the night. The morning had come in under fog so thick you could barely see 200 metres. Then the fog lifted and the wind got up and the sand came with it. And by the time this story starts, the air itself had turned to grit. Somewhere ahead of him, dug into that sand, was the Tawakalna mechanized division of the Iraqi Republican Guard. Not the conscripts. Not the half-starved teenagers who had been walking toward American lines with their hands in the air for 2 days. The Republican Guard were volunteers. They were paid better and fed better and equipped first. And they had spent 8 years fighting Iran, which meant that a great many of the men waiting behind that ridge had been shot at more often than the Americans driving toward them. The date was February 26th, 1991. The place had no name. That is not a figure of speech. There was nothing there to name. No town, no hill worth calling a hill, no river, no road junction. It was a flat sheet of gravel and sand, and the only way to say where you were standing was to read a number off a military grid. The line running north and south through that particular patch of nothing was the 73rd grid line east, the 73 Easting. McMaster's regiment was the covering force for the 7th Corps of the United States Army, the armoured wing that had swung wide through the empty desert to get behind the Republican Guard before it could slip north to Basra. His job was to find the enemy and hold him in place so the heavy divisions coming up behind could kill him. His job was not to attack that enemy on his own, and his job was specifically not to go past the 70th grid line east, which was the limit of advance he had been given. An invisible fence in the sand. Do not cross. In a few minutes he was going to cross it anyway, and he was going to apologize on the radio while he did it. What happened after that has been reconstructed in more forensic detail than any other tank engagement ever fought, anywhere, by anyone. And from the first round to the last, it took 23 minutes. Before we go on, I want to ask you for something small. Cold War Impact is a small channel. We make long, carefully sourced military history documentaries, and our reach has fallen off badly these past months. If this is the kind of work you want to see more of, please subscribe, drop a comment, and share the video with someone who would appreciate it. Every single one of those things helps the channel find new viewers, and it is genuinely the only reason these deep dives are possible. Now, back to the desert. For most of the Cold War, the professional consensus in the West was simple, and it was grim. If the Soviet Union ever came across the inner German border, the Warsaw Pact would win the tank battle. Not because Soviet tanks were better, because there would be so many of them. Soviet armoured doctrine was built on mass and momentum. Push a wall of steel forward faster than your enemy can think. Accept the losses. Do not stop. The T-72 was the mass-produced core of that doctrine. It was built in the tens of thousands. It was sold, licensed, and copied across half the world, and by 1991 it was the most widely fielded modern main battle tank outside NATO. Iraq had hundreds of them. On the morning of February 26, the Tawakalna division was dug in across the American axis of advance with something in the region of 220 T-72s and close to 280 infantry fighting vehicles. Roughly 14,000 men, 2 mechanized brigades and an armored brigade. A United States Army study written afterward called it, without much hedging, probably the best division in the Iraqi army. Against that, the 2nd Armoured Cavalry Regiment was screening forward with light cavalry, and the single troop at the heart of this story, Eagle Troop, had 9 tanks. By dawn on February 27th, the Tawakalna division had ceased to exist. The 2nd Armoured Cavalry Regiment lost 1 man. Now. The reason that happened is not the Abrams tank. That is the answer everybody gives, and it is not exactly wrong, but it is lazy. And it skips straight past the thing that actually decided it. What broke the Iraqi armoured line at the 73 Easting was not a gun, and it was not armour plate. It was the ability to see. And the story of how the United States Army bought that ability is a story about a humiliating defeat that Americans were not even present for, a tank program that collapsed in front of Congress, and a generation of officers who were told, to their faces and correctly, that the army they served in was hollow. To understand 9 tanks in 23 minutes, you have to go back 18 years, to a war in the Sinai that the United States watched from the outside and very nearly failed to learn anything from. On October 6, 1973, Egypt and Syria attacked Israel. At that moment, the Israeli Armored Corps was the most admired in the world. It had won a war in 6 days in 1967, mostly with tanks, mostly by being faster and more aggressive than anyone expected. And that success had hardened into something close to contempt for everything that was not a tank. Tanks won battles. Infantry followed along behind and tidied up. Artillery was a nuisance. In about 72 hours, that idea was taken apart. Egyptian infantry came across the Suez Canal carrying Soviet-made wire-guided anti-tank missiles, the weapon NATO called the Saga, along with rocket launchers. A Saga was cheap. 2 men could carry one. And in the open ground of the Sinai, Israeli tank companies counterattacking exactly the way they had been trained to counterattack drove into curtains of those missiles and were ripped apart. By the 3rd day of the war, the Israelis had lost something on the order of 40% of their tanks. They won anyway, but they won at a cost that terrified every professional soldier who read the after-action reports, and nobody read them more carefully than the Americans, because the Americans had just realized what those reports meant for them. The United States Army in 1973 was in the worst condition it had been in since before the Second World War. It was staggering out of Vietnam. The draft had just ended, and the volunteer army had not yet been built. Discipline in garrison units was collapsing. Drug use was rampant. Equipment was old and worn out. The main battle tank was the M60, which had been a fine machine in 1960 and was now facing Soviet designs that outgunned it. And the army sent officers to Israel to walk those battlefields and count the burned-out hulls and come home and say what they had seen. What they said was that if the Warsaw Pact attacked, the United States Army would lose. Not narrowly. It would be destroyed in the opening battle because it did not have the weapons, the doctrine, the training, or the readiness to survive first contact with massed armor supported by modern anti-tank missiles. That verdict set off one of the most remarkable institutional recoveries in modern military history, and almost nobody outside the profession has ever heard of it. In 1973, the Army stood up a new command whose entire job was to fix how it trained and how it fought. General William Dupuy took it over, and Dupuy was brutal about how bad things were. He tore up the Army's core fighting manual and wrote a new one. Then General Don Starry took over from him. Starry had commanded armor in Vietnam, and he had been sent to walk the ground in the Sinai and on the Golan, and he came back with a bigger idea than Dupuy's. It was not enough, Starry argued, to survive the first wave. You had to be able to see the second wave, the follow-on echelons, still moving up hundreds of kilometers behind the front, and you had to be able to hit them before they ever arrived. You had to fight the enemy's depth. That became the doctrine the Army published in 1982. Air-land battle. It said you win by seeing further than the enemy, deciding faster than the enemy, and striking him at a depth and a tempo he cannot match. And it said something else, something that sounds like a management slogan until the day it saves your life. It said that junior leaders, captains and lieutenants standing in the middle of a fight have to be trusted to decide on their own authority without waiting for permission. Remember that. It comes back. Alongside the doctrine came the hardware. The Army asked for 5 things, and inside the building the program was called the Big Five. A new attack helicopter, which became the Apache. A new transport helicopter, which became the Black Hawk. A new air defense missile, which became the Patriot. A new infantry fighting vehicle, which became the Bradley. And a new tank, none of which looked remotely inevitable at the time. In 1980, the Chief of Staff of the Army, General Edward Meyer, sat in front of Congress and said a sentence that people in uniform still quote. What we have, basically, is a hollow army. That was the institution 11 years before the 73 Easting. And while the Americans were rebuilding from that, an army on the other side of the world was doing the opposite. It was fighting. Here is a thing that almost every popular account of the Gulf War gets wrong. It treats the Iraqi army of 1991 as a punchline. Parts of it were. The conscript infantry divisions along the Kuwaiti border were miserable, badly fed, badly led, and abandoned by their own high command, and they surrendered in enormous numbers, sometimes to journalists, sometimes to aircraft. All of that is true, and all of it is documented, and it has thoroughly poisoned the memory of the rest. Because the Republican Guard was not that army. The Republican Guard recruited separately. Volunteers. Better pay, better housing, first pick of equipment, and the trust of a regime that did not trust anyone. And behind them was the Iran-Iraq War, from 1980 to 1988, the longest conventional war of the 20th century. Trench lines, chemical weapons, massed artillery, human wave assaults, enormous armoured battles. Iraq began that war badly and ended it by running a series of well-planned combined arms offensives in 1988 that broke the Iranian army and forced Tehran to accept a ceasefire. Those offensives were named for a phrase meaning that they placed their trust in God. Tawakalna ala Allah. And the division that spearheaded them took the name. So the formation dug in across the American advance that afternoon was not a paper unit. It was named for a victory. Its officers had planned and executed successful armoured offensives. Its crews had been under fire on and off for the better part of a decade. It had helped lead the invasion of Kuwait 18 months earlier, and it had the T-72. We need to be honest about that tank because the confidence of the men inside it was not stupidity. On paper, it was formidable, and on paper is where most people stop reading. The T-72 mounted a 125mm smoothbore cannon, bigger than the gun on anything NATO fielded through the 1970s. It was low and it was small, which matters enormously when you are sitting in a hole in the ground with only your turret showing. It was mechanically simple, and it used an automatic loader, which meant 3 men instead of 4, which meant a smaller turret, which meant less tank for an enemy to hit. In Soviet hands, with Soviet ammunition and Soviet fire control, it was a genuinely dangerous machine. Iraq did not have that tank. What Iraq had was the export model, and Iraq also built its own copies under the name Lion of Babylon. The armour was thinner, and the steel was worse. The fire control was simpler. And the night vision was not night vision in any sense a Western tank crew would recognise. It was an active infrared searchlight, a technology from the 1960s which works by shining an invisible beam at whatever you want to look at, which has the obvious flaw that anyone with the right equipment can see the beam, and the less obvious flaw that it is close to useless in dust. The ammunition was worse than the tank. A modern tank round does not kill by explosion. It kills with a dart, a long, dense rod fired at colossal speed that punches through armour on kinetic energy alone. The good ones in 1991 were made of tungsten or depleted uranium. What the Iraqi army had in its racks for the 125mm gun were older Soviet rounds with steel penetrators. One of the main types had been pulled out of Soviet frontline service back in 1973. Against the front of an American tank, that ammunition simply could not do the job it existed to do. The Iraqi crews did not know that. There is no reason on earth they should have known it. Nobody had ever fired that gun at that armour. What their commander did know was his ground, and this is the part of the story that almost always gets erased, so let us not erase it. The officer who laid out the defence that Eagle Troop drove into was an Iraqi major. According to McMaster, who got the story afterward from his own troopers, the man had been trained in the United States. He was a graduate of the Infantry Officer Advanced Course at Fort Benning, Georgia. He understood American doctrine because the Americans had taught it to him, and he built his defence to beat it. He picked ground with a rise in it, so slight that you would not call it terrain at all, and he put his tanks on the far side of it. A reverse slope defence. The attacker sees nothing until he crests the rise, and at the instant he crests it, he is skylined, in the open, at close range, and every gun below him is already laid on the exact patch of dirt he is standing on. He built 2 kill sacks, one north and one south of a village. He dug in around 40 tanks and 16 infantry fighting vehicles about a kilometre back from the crest. He seeded minefields. He pushed an observation post forward into a bunker so he would get warning, and he held 18 more tanks in reserve 3 kilometres to the rear, ready to counterattack anything that punched through. That is not the work of a fool. That is a textbook defence. And against any enemy the Iraqi army had ever faced, it would have worked. His one false assumption was about navigation. He assumed, entirely reasonably, that an army moving through a featureless desert in a sandstorm would have to hug the roads, because that is what every army in history had been forced to do. There are no landmarks out there. There is nothing to take a bearing from. In a sandstorm, you cannot even find the sun. So he anchored his defense on the roads in the village because that is where the Americans would have to come. He did not know that the vehicles rolling toward him could ask a constellation of satellites exactly where they were, to within a few meters at any moment, in any weather, and get an answer. The answer to the Soviet tank was not a bigger gun. The physics of it is almost embarrassingly simple. Anything warmer than its surroundings radiates heat. A tank engine is a furnace. A gun tube that has just fired is a torch. A man's body against cold desert sand at night burns like a lamp. All of that energy is pouring off continuously in a part of the spectrum the human eye cannot see, and, crucially, in a part of the spectrum that punches through dust and smoke and haze far better than visible light ever will. Build a sensor that sees in that band. Put it in a tank. You have not improved the tank. You have changed what a tank battle is. By 1991, the M1A1 Abrams and the M3 Bradley both carried thermal sights as standard. They were not magic, they were slow to cool down, they needed constant maintenance, and the crews complained about them endlessly, which is what crews do about everything. But in a sandstorm in the Iraqi desert on the afternoon of February 26th, an American gunner looking through that sight could find an Iraqi tank, identify it as an Iraqi tank, lay his gun on it, and kill it at 2,000 meters and beyond. An Iraqi gunner in the same sandstorm, looking through his optics, could see almost nothing at all. That is the battle. Everything else is detail. But the detail is worth having because the Abrams was not only a machine that could see in the dark. Its 120mm smoothbore fired a depleted uranium dart that the crews called the silver bullet. Depleted uranium is extraordinarily dense, and it has a property that makes it particularly vicious as a penetrator. It self-sharpens. As it grinds through steel, it sheds material in a way that keeps the tip pointed instead of mushrooming flat. That round left the muzzle at roughly 1.5 miles per second, and it would kill at 3,000 meters. The tank around the gun was built from composite armor, layers of steel and ceramic, and by the time the Gulf deployment sailed, much of the fleet had been fitted with an additional layer containing depleted uranium. The front of an M1A1 in 1991 was effectively immune to everything Iraq had. The gun was fully stabilized, which means the barrel stays locked on the target while the tank is bouncing across broken ground at speed. American tanks could shoot accurately on the move. Iraqi tanks, in practice, had to stop to shoot, and the ammunition was stored in a separate compartment in the back of the turret, behind an armored door, with panels in the roof designed to blow outward. If the ammunition is hit, the explosion is vented up and away from the crew. The T-72 does not do that. Its automatic loader keeps the ammunition in a carousel, a ring of shells and propellant, inside the crew compartment, underneath the turret, surrounded by the men. There is nowhere for an explosion to go. If a penetrating round reaches that carousel, the entire load detonates at once inside the hull, and the turret, which weighs several tons, is thrown clear of the tank. Everybody has seen that now. In 1991, almost nobody had, and none of it, not the gun, not the armor, not the sight, would have mattered without the last piece. In the 1980s, the Army built something in the Mojave Desert that had no real precedent anywhere in the world. The National Training Center at Fort Irwin was a vast stretch of California desert where whole battalions went to fight a permanently stationed opposing force, equipped and trained and organized to fight in the Soviet style. Every vehicle carried a laser system. Every hit was recorded, and afterward the visiting unit sat in a tent while men with clipboards told them, in front of each other, precisely how and why they had been slaughtered. Nearly everybody lost at Fort Irwin. That was the entire point of Fort Irwin. By 1991, the officers and sergeants of the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment had crested that ridge and found that dug in enemy and died for it, over and over in California, and gone back to the tent and learned. One of Eagle Troop's gunners said afterward that they had trained so hard and so often that when the real thing came, it felt like another field problem. That is what 9 tanks brought into the sandstorm. Now let us talk about how close the United States came to never building any of it. In 1963, the United States and West Germany agreed to build a tank together. It was going to be the tank that settled the argument for a generation. It was called the Main Battle Tank, 1970. On paper, it was a marvel. It had a suspension that let the whole vehicle crouch down behind cover. It was fast. It mounted a gun that could fire both conventional rounds and a guided missile out to ranges no tank gun could reach. And it had one design decision that engineers still tell each other about, the way sailors tell each other about ships that turned over in harbour. In order to keep the hull as low as possible, the designers took the driver out of the hull and put him up in the turret inside a capsule that was supposed to counter-rotate, spinning against the turret's traverse so that he always faced forward. It did not reliably keep him facing forward. Drivers reported disorientation. Evaluators reported that the mechanism made men sick. And it was one more complicated thing to break on a vehicle that already had far too many complicated things on it. Then the costs went vertical. The projected price per tank climbed to something like 5 times the original estimate. West Germany walked away at the end of the 1960s and went off to build what became the Leopard 2. The United States tried to save the program with a cheaper, stripped-down version. Congress looked at the cheaper version and looked at the money already burned, and in December 1971 it killed both. That is the flaw. That is the bottom of the hole. After 8 years and an enormous amount of public money, the United States Army had no new tank, no agreed plan for a new tank, a Soviet enemy fielding new designs by the thousand, and a Congress that had just learned to disbelieve every word the Army said about armoured vehicles. Out of that wreckage, on a much tighter leash and a much smaller budget, came the program that produced the M1 Abrams, which entered service in 1980. The tank that fought at the 73 Easting exists because a spectacular public failure cleared the ground for it, and even then, almost nobody believed in it. The Abrams was attacked continuously and publicly for most of the decade before the Gulf War. Too heavy, said the critics. Too complicated, too expensive. And above all, too thirsty because the Army had bolted a gas turbine into it, essentially a helicopter engine, and it drank fuel in a way that horrified anyone responsible for supplying it. The turbine was the single most contested decision in the program. Government auditors argued for a diesel instead, and there was a specific repeated worry about what would happen if you ever took that engine somewhere hot and full of sand. The desert, the critics warned, would be inhaled. That warning was still hanging in the air in August 1990 when American armour began unloading in Saudi Arabia. So was something darker. Through the autumn and winter, serious and credentialed people made public predictions about the price of a ground war with Iraq. Zbigniew Brzezinski, who had been National Security Advisor, put it at 20,000 American casualties. The commentator Patrick Buchanan said 30,000. Senator Edward Kennedy suggested American casualties might run around 3,000 a week. Pentagon estimates reported in the press that September ran to tens of thousands of dead and wounded. Nothing about those predictions was unreasonable. Iraq had the 4th largest army in the world. It was dug in. It had chemical weapons and had already used them, on Iranians and on its own citizens. It had 8 years of combat experience that the Americans did not have. They were wrong by an order of magnitude, and the afternoon of February 26th is a large part of why. So before the shooting starts, here is the arithmetic. Understand this and you will understand everything that follows. The Abrams can see a T-72 through a sandstorm at 2,000 meters and further. The T-72 in that sandstorm effectively cannot see the Abrams until it is far too late. The Abrams gun kills a T-72 at 3,000 meters. The Iraqi gun, firing the ammunition Iraq actually possessed, could not reliably penetrate the frontal armor of an M1A1 at any range on that battlefield. Not at 2,000 meters. Not at 1,000. Not at 400. The Abrams shoots accurately while moving. The T-72, in practice, stops. If the Abrams ammunition is hit, the crew has a real chance of climbing out. If the T-72's ammunition is hit, the tank takes itself apart. Read those 6 lines and look for the line where the Iraqi tank has an advantage. There isn't one. This was not a duel. It was a mismatch so complete that the Americans who won it have spent 30 years being slightly uncomfortable about how it sounds. But none of that was known on the morning of February 26th, 1991. Not by the men in the tanks. Nobody had ever fought this battle. There was no precedent to reason from. The last time a Western army had fought a serious armoured battle against a Soviet-equipped enemy in the Sinai in 1973, the Western army had been mauled. The American crews grinding east through the sand that morning had been raised on the assumption that they would be outnumbered, that the enemy would come at them 3-1, and that a war against modern armour would be paid for in an enormous number of American funerals. They also had a problem that no technology solves. They did not know where the enemy was. The weather had grounded the air cavalry for most of the day, and a reverse slope defense, by definition, is invisible until you are standing on top of it. The 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment was going to find the Tawakalna division the way cavalry has found the enemy, since there were horses. By running into it. Eagle Troop came east through the storm with 9 M1A1 Abrams, about 12 Bradley cavalry fighting vehicles, a mortar section, and somewhere around 140 men. 2 scout platoons in the Bradleys and 2 tank platoons behind them, scouts forward, which is exactly how cavalry is supposed to move. To the north was Ghost Troop, to the south, Iron Troop. Behind the regiment, the 1st Infantry Division was staged and waiting to pass through and take up the attack once the cavalry had found the enemy. At 16:07 hours, a Bradley commanded by Staff Sergeant John McReynolds drove straight over an Iraqi bunker. It was the observation post the Iraqi major had pushed forward so that he would not be surprised. 2 Iraqi soldiers climbed out of it and surrendered. Seconds later, McReynolds' wingman started taking fire from the buildings ahead. Machine guns and 23mm anti-aircraft fire coming in flat and level, which is a deeply unpleasant thing to have arriving at a lightly armoured vehicle. The scouts had found the enemy at close range in filthy visibility with no idea whatsoever what was standing behind him. What McMaster did next took him about 10 seconds. He had Lieutenant Tim Gauthier put a Tau missile into the centre of the village to orient everybody. Then his own gunner put a tank round into the same place to mark it, and then all 9 tanks fired high explosive into that village simultaneously. Then he changed the formation. In cavalry, the scouts lead. McMaster pulled his tanks forward and put them in front instead, in a line, and drove. In the language of the profession, a movement to contact had just become a hasty attack. In plain English, a 28-year-old captain had decided that whatever was waiting on the other side of that rise, the safest thing he could possibly do was to go through it fast and hit it first. The lead tanks crested the almost invisible swell of ground that the Iraqi major had chosen so carefully, and his gunner, Staff Sergeant Craig Koch, said 3 words: "Tanks direct front." McMaster counted 8 T-72s. Dug in. Hull down. In prepared positions. Waiting. Koch fired. The first round hit the first tank and the turret came off it. Koch traversed and fired again. Second tank. Dead. The loader, Private First Class Jeffrey Taylor, was hauling rounds into the breach faster than he ever had in his life, and he admitted afterward that he had been right on the edge of panic and had told himself, in so many words, "Do not panic. Do your job." Koch fired a 3rd time. 3rd tank. Dead. Within about a minute, by McMaster's own account, everything in range of Eagle Troop's guns was burning, and it was somewhere around then that the driver, Specialist Christopher Hedenskog, came up on the intercom with something he had been holding on to because there had not been a good moment to mention it. "Sir," he said, "I think you need to know. We just went through a minefield." He had seen the mines. He had steered between them at speed, in a sandstorm, while keeping the tank's thickest armour pointed at the enemy, and he had said nothing at the time because there was nothing anybody could have done with the information. Eagle Troop kept driving. Then the executive officer, Lieutenant John Gifford, came up on the radio with the one piece of information the whole troop had forgotten and regiment had not. He said, in effect, that he knew this was the last thing his commander wanted to hear right now, but they were at the limit of advance. They were at the 70 easting. They were past the line, in contact unsupported, driving deeper into a Republican Guard defensive belt outside the boundary they had been ordered to respect. McMaster's answer is documented, and it is the reason this battle is taught the way it is taught. Tell them we can't stop. Tell them we're in contact, and we have to continue this attack. Tell them I'm sorry. That is the whole decision. There was no discussion. There was no request for permission. A captain in a sandstorm with burning Iraqi armour in front of his tank concluded that halting inside an enemy engagement area would get his men killed, and that the doctrine he had been raised on, the one that said leaders in contact must be trusted to decide, actually meant what it said. So he kept attacking. And he apologised while he did it. And he did not stop. The Iraqi Major's reserve, the 18 tanks he had held 3 kilometres back to counterattack exactly this kind of penetration, began to move. They came out of cover into open ground, and they came into the thermal sights of an enemy they could not see, at ranges from which they could not answer. Eagle Troop destroyed them where they stood. Then the Iraqis counterattacked with what was left, a company's worth of tanks and infantry fighting vehicles, driving hard into the flank of the American advance, which is exactly the correct response, and which in those circumstances was also a form of suicide. 3 Bradleys from Lieutenant Michael Petschek's platoon, moving north to link back up with Ghost Troop, ran into them and destroyed 4 more T-72s. At the 73rd Grid Line East, McMaster stopped. He stopped because the 1st Infantry Division was coming up behind him, and 2 American formations colliding in that dust would have been a catastrophe. And he stopped, in his own words, because there was nothing left in front of him to shoot at. 23 minutes. Eagle Troop lost no tanks. Eagle Troop lost no Bradleys. Not one man in the troop was killed. Iraqi tanks had fired back. Iraqi tanks had hit American vehicles. The rounds had failed. If the story ended there, it would be a very good story and a slightly dishonest one. Because Eagle Troop's 23 minutes were not the hardest fighting along the 73 Easting that day. They were the cleanest. Those are not the same thing. A few kilometers north, Ghost Troop was fighting a battle that went on for hours, and it was ugly. The ground in front of Ghost Troop had a wadi running through it, a dry watercourse, and the Iraqis used it. Instead of sitting in prepared positions waiting to die, Iraqi armor came up that wadi in waves, counterattacking. Again and again and again, T-72s from the Tawakalna, older T-55s from an Iraqi armored division that came in from the flank. They kept coming after dark. They kept coming long after any reasonable man would have stopped coming. That fact ought to permanently retire the idea that the Iraqis at the 73 Easting did not fight. They fought. They counterattacked an enemy they could not see in the dark, taking losses from ranges at which they were physically incapable of replying, and they did it repeatedly. Ghost Troop held. It held partly because Colonel Garrett Bourne's Field Artillery Brigade fired for it continuously, out past the 78th Grid Line East, and partly because the troops simply refused to break. And at around 1700 hours, an Iraqi round hit the turret of a Ghost Troop Bradley. The gunner inside was Sergeant Nels Moller. He was 23 years old. He was from Paul, Idaho, a farming town of a couple of thousand people. His TOW launcher was not working. His 25mm cannon had jammed. He was fighting anyway, with what he had left, which was not much. He was killed instantly. Sergeant Nels Moller was the only American killed in the Battle of the 73 Easting. There was one more casualty that afternoon that nobody likes to talk about. In the southern sector, a TOW missile fired by a Bradley from one American troop struck a Bradley from another and wounded all 3 of its crew. In the dust and the dark and the confusion, with thermal sights showing nothing but hot shapes at long range, that is what happens. It is the most sobering footnote in the whole story of thermal imaging. The same sight that lets you kill an enemy you cannot see with your eyes will also let you kill a friend you cannot see with your eyes. Just after 2200 hours, the 1st Infantry Division passed forward through the cavalry and took up the pursuit. Hundreds of Iraqi prisoners came back the other way. And here, according to McMaster, is what the Iraqi major who built that defense told an American trooper afterward. He said he had not known he was under attack at all until one of his own soldiers came running into his command bunker, shouting a single word, twice. Tanks. Tanks. That is what a thermal sight actually does. It does not just let you shoot further. It lets you arrive inside a man's plan before he knows there is a battle. Now, here is where this becomes genuinely strange because of what the United States Army did next. Normally, a battle ends and the paperwork begins. And within a few years the accounts contradict each other, and the veterans remember different things and historians argue about it forever. That is the fate of every engagement ever fought. Not this one. Within months, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency and the Institute for Defense Analyses, with the personal backing of the Army Chief of Staff, General Gordon Sullivan, who had himself been a cavalryman, launched a project to rebuild the battle. Not summarize it. Rebuild it. Second by second. Vehicle by vehicle, round by round. Teams went back to the ground while the wrecks were still sitting there. They photographed and mapped every destroyed Iraqi vehicle and recorded its exact position and the direction it was facing. They pulled the navigation printouts from the American vehicles and retraced every route. They collected the recorded radio traffic. They counted rounds expended against targets hit. And they interviewed the men, individually walking each one back through what he had seen and when he had seen it. What came out the other end was a simulation of the battle so complete that you could stand inside any vehicle at any moment and look out through its sights. The published account of that work is an Institute for Defense Analyses document from April 1992, edited by Jesse Orlansky and Colonel Jack Thorpe of the United States Air Force. It is the reason we can speak about this engagement with a precision available for no other battle in history. The writer Bruce Sterling, visiting the project for Wired magazine, called the 73 Easting the single most accurately recorded combat engagement in human history. And it is that reconstruction that lets us do the one thing a documentary is actually obliged to do, which is to turn around and check whether the story it has just told is true. So let us check it. 9 Abrams tanks. That is true, and it is exactly true. Eagle Troop had 9 and no more. But 9 tanks did not win the Battle of the 73 Easting. 9 tanks won Eagle Troop's 23 minutes. Ghost Troop and Iron Troop and the guns and the aircraft won the rest of it, and Ghost Troop is where the American who died. If you remember nothing else from this, remember that. 23 minutes. That is McMaster's own figure, and he has used it consistently for more than 30 years. It describes Eagle Troop's engagement from first round to last. It does not describe the battle. The battle went on for hours, and in the north it went on into the night. 10-1. This is the one that needs the most care. In the ground directly in front of Eagle Troop, the Iraqi major had dug in about 40 tanks and held 18 more in reserve against 9. Across the sector he controlled, McMaster has described the enemy as having had more than 10 times the tanks he did, and as a description of Eagle Troop's fight, that is defensible. As a description of the whole regiment against the whole division, it is not. Anyone who tells you the 2nd Armoured Cavalry Regiment was outnumbered 10-1 across the board is inflating it. Then there is the kill count, and here the honest answer is the least satisfying one. McMaster's own figure, given at the time and repeated since, is roughly 50 tanks, 25 armoured personnel carriers, and 40 trucks. The more conservative reconstructions, working from counted wrecks, give figures closer to 28 tanks, 16 carriers, and 30 trucks, for Eagle Troop specifically, and attribute the larger numbers to the squadron as a whole. Both figures appear in serious sources. The truthful thing to say is that Eagle Troop destroyed somewhere between roughly 30 and roughly 50 Iraqi armoured vehicles, plus a great many trucks in 23 minutes, that the exact number depends entirely on where you draw the line between one troop's kills and its neighbours, and that on a battlefield that dark and that crowded, some of those kills simply cannot be assigned to a single gun. Now, the number that is not in dispute anywhere. Across the entire Gulf War, the number of M1 Abrams tanks destroyed by Iraqi fire was 0. Not a low number. 0. Abrams tanks were lost. 23 were destroyed or damaged across the campaign, and of the 9 that were destroyed outright, 7 were hit by American weapons, and 2 were deliberately blown up by their own side to stop them falling into enemy hands. Several Abrams took direct hits from Iraqi 125mm tank guns and kept fighting. An Iraqi crew, firing the ammunition their army had issued them at an American tank, at a range where they could actually see it, could not kill it. That is not rhetoric. That is a number, and the number is 0. And now the correction. The part a responsible account has to include, and the part almost every retelling leaves out. There is a comfortable version of this story in which the Republican Guard at the 73 Easting was already a shattered, air-pulverized wreck, and the ground battle was a mopping-up operation dressed up as a triumph. Where the 73 Easting is concerned, that version is mostly wrong. The Tawakalna moved into its blocking position in the last day or two before the American attack. The United States Army's own study of the battle concluded that in spite of the air campaign, most of that division was in position and ready to fight when the 7th Corps arrived. It was not a corps. It was a functioning armoured division conducting a rearguard action, which is one of the hardest missions in warfare, in order to buy time for the rest of the Republican Guard to get away north. And it did what a rearguard is supposed to do. It stood, it fought, it counterattacked. It was destroyed anyway. The most careful work on why comes from the defense analyst Stephen Biddle, who took the reconstruction data and ran the battle again with the variables changed. His conclusion, published in 1996, is the single most important sentence anyone has written about this engagement. Technology alone does not explain it. Skill alone does not explain it. It was the interaction of the two. Biddle's modelling suggested that if the Iraqi crews had been trained to Western standards and had used their ground and their weapons the way a Western army would have used them, American losses at the 73 Easting would have been catastrophic. Most of the attacking force, with all the same American equipment. The technology did not make the outcome inevitable. It made the outcome available. Fort Irwin is what collected it, which is the same lesson the Israelis paid for in the Sinai in 1973, arriving 18 years later with the sign reversed. One last piece of housekeeping, and it is an awkward one. The operations officer of the squadron that day was a major named Douglas McGregor. He fought in the battle. His tank struck an anti-tank mine and he pressed on. He has since written a book about the 73 Easting, in which he presents himself as, in effect, the author of the victory, and in which he settles a considerable number of scores with senior American commanders. His account has been disputed. A profile published in 1997 quoted an unnamed superior officer saying that McGregor had not requested artillery support or reported events upward until the fighting was nearly finished. We're not going to adjudicate that here, and it would be wrong to pretend it can be adjudicated from the outside. But you should know it exists, because when you go and read about this battle, you will encounter two versions of who won it, and it is worth knowing that one of those versions is being told by the man who wrote the book. What is not disputed is that Captain H.R. McMaster commanded Eagle Troop, made the decision to attack through the limit of advance, and received the Silver Star. The men who did the shooting did not become famous. Craig Koch, the gunner who killed 3 T-72s in about a minute, is a name almost nobody knows. Christopher Hedenskog, who steered a 60-ton tank through a live minefield at speed and did not consider it worth interrupting anyone about, is a name almost nobody knows. Jeffrey Taylor, the loader who told himself not to panic and kept the rounds coming, is a name almost nobody knows. And Nels Moller is buried in Idaho. The one man from that troop whose name travelled went somewhere nobody in that sandstorm could have predicted. H.R. McMaster went back to school and took a doctorate in history. He wrote a book about the American Joint Chiefs of Staff during the Vietnam War, a study of how senior officers failed to tell their political leadership the truth, and it became required reading inside the institution it criticised. He commanded a cavalry regiment in Iraq in 2005 in a completely different kind of war, and ran one of the few counterinsurgency operations of that period, still studied as a success. He rose to Lieutenant General. He served briefly and turbulently as National Security Advisor of the United States. He has spent more than 30 years being asked about 23 minutes. And what he says about them, consistently, is not about the tank. It is that his soldiers had rehearsed chaos so many times that when the real thing arrived, they did not have to stop and think about it. The Tawakalna division was gone by the morning of February 27. The Republican Guard as an institution was dissolved after the American invasion of 2003. The formation whose name commemorated the moment Iraq stopped Iran does not exist in any form today. The T-72 does. In February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine, and the tank that has done most of the fighting on the Russian side is the T-72. Newer marks. Far better fire control than Iraq ever had. Explosive reactive armour bolted over the front. But the same fundamental machine and, crucially, the same automatic loader, with the same carousel of shells and propellant sitting inside the crew compartment with nowhere for an explosion to go. The result has been the best documented destruction of armour since 1945. Independent researchers working only from photographic and video evidence confirmed more than 1,000 T-72s destroyed, abandoned or captured in the first year of the war alone, and by the middle of this decade the visually confirmed total of Russian tanks of all types lost had passed 4,000. And these are minimums. They only count what somebody photographed. And the image that has come to define that war, the one every person watching this has seen without necessarily knowing where it came from, is the turret of a T-72 lying upside down in a field, 30 or 40 meters from the burnt-out hull that threw it there. That is the same flaw. Precisely the same flaw. American analysts identified it in the wrecks along the 73 Easting in 1991. It was never fixed, because fixing it would mean designing a different tank. But this is where the story turns, and this is the part that should unsettle anyone who thinks the lesson here is simply that better tanks win. In September 2023, the United States sent 31 Abrams tanks to Ukraine. The first one was destroyed near the town of Avdiivka on or about February 26, 2024. 33 years, almost to the day, after the 73 Easting. It was not killed by a tank, it was killed by a first-person view drone. An aircraft assembled from commercial parts costing a few $100s, flown into the back of the turret by a man sitting in a trench some kilometers away wearing a pair of video goggles. The blowout panels worked exactly as they were designed to work. The ammunition burned upward and out instead of detonating inside the hull. In that narrow engineering sense, the Abrams was still doing its job, still keeping its crew alive in a way the T-72 has never managed. But the tank was dead, and the thing that killed it cost less than a second-hand motorcycle. Within a couple of months, Ukraine pulled its remaining Abrams back from the most exposed parts of the front, because the sheer density of drone surveillance overhead had made a large, hot, 60-ton object almost impossible to hide. Of that original 31, open-source tracking suggests the great majority have now been destroyed, abandoned or captured. And in a detail that would have been unthinkable in 1991, at least one of them is reported to have been killed by the gun of a T-72. That is the inversion. At the 73 Easting, one side brought a machine the other side was physically incapable of destroying. That is the whole battle in one sentence. The Iraqi army had experience, a well-built defense, a competent commander, and a tank with a bigger gun, and none of it mattered, because they could not see and they could not kill. That condition, the condition of absolute invulnerability, no longer exists. It lasted, historically speaking, about a generation. It is gone. There is no piece of ground on a modern battlefield where a tank cannot be seen, and there is no tank so well protected that something cheap enough cannot kill it. Which is why the United States Army cancelled the next scheduled upgrade of the Abrams. The tank had been getting heavier with every generation, grinding upward toward 80 tons, and the Army looked hard at Ukraine and concluded that this was simply the wrong direction to be walking in. The replacement is being built around a lighter vehicle, somewhere near 60 tons. A modular design that can be updated quickly instead of every 20 years. Hybrid electric drive. Active protection systems designed specifically to shoot down the drones and the top attack missiles that now do most of the killing. And an unmanned turret, with an automatic loader, reducing the crew to 3. Read that list one more time. A lighter tank, a smaller crew, an automatic loader. The United States is moving, cautiously and with a great deal of engineering the Soviets never bothered with, towards some of the very design choices that killed Iraqi tank crews at the 73 Easting. Not because those choices were right then, because the battlefield that punished them has been replaced by a battlefield that punishes something else entirely. The tank is not finished. Both sides in Ukraine still need armor, still use armor, and still cannot take ground or hold it without armor. What is finished is the era in which one army could bring a weapon that the other army simply had no answer to. That era began with a hollow force, a cancelled tank, and a general telling Congress an uncomfortable truth. It was built by men who lost over and over in a California desert so that they would not lose in a real one. And it peaked on a February afternoon in 1991 in a sandstorm on a stretch of ground so featureless it had to be described by a number when a captain who had been ordered to stop decided that stopping would kill his men. The Iraqi major did everything right. He read the ground. He sighted his guns. He held a reserve. He built a defense that would have worked against any enemy his army had ever met. And he lost his division to men he never saw, using a technology nobody had told him existed, and he did not learn that a battle had begun until one of his soldiers ran into his bunker shouting one word, twice. Every army that has ever been destroyed in an afternoon was destroyed by something it did not know was there. The question worth asking is not whether the 73 Easting could happen again. It is which side next time will be the one in the bunker.